Case number 1. William Arnold Newton. William Arnold Newton was born in the bustling city of Eau Claire, Wisconsin. He began his educational journey there and enjoyed learning from the warm atmosphere until 1979, when his family moved to Ladysmith, Wisconsin. In 1980, after Newton's freshman year of high school had finished, he and his mother relocated to Oklahoma City. Newton's father, Richard Harriman, described his son as a very intelligent young man. He had a lot of things going his way the last year or two. He was just starting to make a life for himself. However, Richard further mentioned that his son had his struggles, describing him as a restless kid who had been perpetually searching for his own identity. Eager to see the world and explore beyond the bounds of California, Newton took off at age 16 and traveled the United States for 3 full years before ultimately settling in Los Angeles in 1985. During his stay in Los Angeles, he found a job working at the Hollywood Spa, a gay bathhouse. Whilst working there, Newton encountered David Ray, an adult film producer who offered him the chance to star in several gay adult videos. Eventually, Newton and Ray developed a romance, which resulted in the formation of London Ray Productions in 1987. Working under the pseudonym Bill E. London, Newton's job at London Ray was simple. He was the movie producer, makeup artist, and set designer. By fall of 1990, Newton had decided to depart from Los Angeles and relocate to Las Vegas. Sadly, fate had something else in store for him. Newton was killed shortly after wrapping up production on what would have been his final movie, The Grip of Passion. He was last seen at Rage nightclub in West Hollywood. The day after the murder, a passerby stumbled upon Newton's body in a dumpster close to Santa Monica Boulevard. At the time of his death, Detective Ron Veneman stated that authorities were pursuing several promising leads but had not yet found anything solid. Furthermore, he mentioned they held other confidential information which could not be disclosed at this point in time. Despite the police's best efforts, Newton's case went on to become unsolved for many years. In 2005, Detective Wendy Berndt declared that she would be revisiting Williams' case with the hope of technological advances facilitating a break in the investigation. Berndt was an integral part of the investigation into Williams' case when it first began, but as the years went by and progress came to a sudden halt, she had been moved to different departments. When Berndt took the helm of Hollywood's LAPD homicide unit, she put forth a tremendous amount of effort to make sure that the media was aware of the Newton murder. On the 15th anniversary of Newton's passing, Fox 11 journalist Tony Valdez met up with Berndt and visited the site where the horrendous crime took place. However, in December 2006, journalist Mickey Ski reported that Newton's dad had reached out to him and revealed that the Los Angeles Police Department put the investigation into his son's homicide on hold. In 2020, New York Times best-selling authors Christopher Rice and Eric Shaw Quinn revisited this chilling case on episode 37 of their podcast, TDPS Presents Christopher and Eric, to uncover more details about this tragic event. They created an email address devoted to any tips or information regarding the 30-year-old case. On their 48th podcast installment, they unveiled an account of a potential eyewitness who claimed they were among the last to see William Newton alive before his death. This eyewitness recalled seeing Newton leaving the nightclub in the company of a man bearing a strong resemblance to notorious serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, who was apprehended a year later for committing multiple murders, many of which targeting gay men in Milwaukee. At the start of 2021, an LAPD homicide detective in charge of Newton's case reached out to Rice and Quinn due to the success of their podcast concerning this crime. On February 2021, a new episode of the podcast was aired featuring an exclusive interview with the detective who inherited this particular case. Although many authors, filmmakers, Podcasters and self-styled detectives have sought to uncover the truth of Newton's death. The true identity of the person responsible for his death remained a mystery. Or at least that was the case until February 7th, 2023, when the Los Angeles Police Department made a shocking announcement. William Newton's killer was at last identified. Unlike what everyone had thought, it wasn't Jeffrey Dahmer. The murderer's name was Darrell Lynn Madden, a former neo-Nazi white supremacist that previously went by the name Darrell and now identifies as a Jewish woman. As reported by the Los Angeles Times, Newton's murder was a robbery gone wrong. This is how it went down, according to Darrell Lynn. On the evening of October 29, 1990, Darrell Lynn approached Newton with the intent of robbing him. With a serene voice, she warned Newton that he was going to get robbed, abducted, and possibly suffer physical harm, but would remain alive if he kept quiet and avoid drawing attention. Unfortunately, this story was all a ruse. The coroner at the time would later confirm that Darrell Lynn strangled Newton to death and then proceeded to violate his body in a horrific fashion. Investigators were able to uncover the truth behind Newton's murder after Darrell Lynn pleaded guilty to killing a gay man in Oklahoma named Stephen Domer and another man named Bradley Quayles, who was Darrell Lynn's accomplice in Stephen's murder. Ironically, Madden herself was a former gay adult actor named Billy Houston in the early 90s. At one point, she even shaved off both eyebrows and tattooed the words "skin" and "head." According to criminal psychologists, Darrell Lynn's cold-blooded killing of Newton likely stemmed from her own self-loathing, considering she was once involved in the gay adult industry as well. Despite a damning confession, Darrell Lynn, at least for now, will remain free of criminal charges as county officials deemed available evidence insufficient to secure a guilty verdict. Darrell Lynn has also refrained from answering particular questions regarding the case, likely in order to avoid incriminating any potential accomplices. "I may be a murderer, but I'm not a snitch," she said. In the end, the Los Angeles Police Department's Robbery and Homicide Division decided to close William Newton's case as they now had reason to believe William's murderer is under custody. If there's any silver lining to this story, it's that, at the very least, after 3 decades of uncertainty and torment for William's family, they can finally find solace in knowing that his killer is behind bars and can never harm anyone the way he harmed William ever again. Case number 2, Rita Curran. In the summer of 1971, Rita Curran had just taken her first steps towards independence. She moved out of her parents' house into an apartment on Brooks Avenue in Burlington, Vermont. Although unfamiliar with all 3 roommates that resided there, the 24-year-old was determined to start anew and began graduate courses at the University of Vermont while also working as a maid at a local motel. On top of all that, 24-year-old Rita was also employed as a second-grade school teacher. On the morning of July 20th, 1971, Rita's roommate made a gruesome discovery. Rita was lying lifelessly on the floor of their apartment. The Burlington police soon arrived and began uncovering the traumatic details surrounding her untimely death. She had suffered a violent assault that caused extensive bruising all over her body. Curran's motel was located close to the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers, the birthplace of notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. As certain similarities between her death and previously known crime scenes linked to Bundy were identified by retired FBI agent John Bassett, Curran's sister sent a telegram directly to Florida's death row, inquiring as to his possible involvement in her sister's death. In response to the inquiry, the FBI reported that Bundy had refused to admit or deny his involvement. Although municipal records indicated someone with the name Bundy was attacked by a dog during that week, there was no substantial evidence confirming his presence in Burlington on the exact date. Bundy was interrogated by detectives and eventually led on that he did recall having murdered a young Burlington woman in 1971. Yet, on January 22, 1989, the day prior to his execution date, Bundy, when questioned about the Curran case in particular, denied any and all involvement. At the crime scene, law enforcement officers had gathered evidence that included a lone cigarette butt, which was found near Rita's arm. Unfortunately, DNA technology at the time was limited, and so, even with the murderer's DNA likely on that cigarette, they could not be identified. Some of Rita's neighbors in the apartment building were questioned. A married couple living 2 floors above Curran's when she was killed was also interviewed as part of the investigation. William DeRoos, who had a criminal record, attested that he and his wife Michelle were in their apartment all night long. They told officers that they had not heard or seen anything suspicious. Ultimately, no likely suspect was found by the police despite their best efforts. With no new evidence, witnesses, or suspects coming up, Rita Curran's case ultimately went cold. But then, in 2014, 43 years after the murder, the Burlington Police Department requested further DNA analysis of all evidence collected at the crime scene, including the cigarette butt. Despite managing to generate a DNA profile of the person who smoked that cigarette, said DNA profile didn't correlate with any existing data from law enforcement agencies in the U.S., possibly because the person it belonged to had no prior felony convictions on record. In 2019, Detective Lieutenant James Tribb took a new approach to the case and assembled a team of detectives, technicians, and experts instead of relying on just one detective as per departmental protocol. He wanted to treat this case as if it had just happened in order to account for any crucial details that may have slipped through the cracks previously. To further their investigation, the team analyzed the cigarette butt using genetic genealogy. Genetic genealogy combines modern genetic genealogy techniques such as DNA profiling with the more traditional genealogical methods. It makes it possible to identify anyone as long as their profile matches that of someone else's in the nation's database. Subsequently, a specialized genetic genealogist deduced that the cigarette DNA sample had powerful correlation to William DeRoos's blood relatives on both his paternal and maternal sides. All that was needed to be 100% certain was a sample from DeRoos himself. Unfortunately, DeRoos had long passed away in 1983 in a San Francisco hotel due to a drug overdose. Undeterred by this, detectives managed to discover a living half-brother of DeRoos. They were able to obtain a DNA sample that matched the cigarette butt found at the scene. Furthermore, when analyzing Curran's torn housecoat, it became evident that the same DNA present on the cigarette was also lying there. The evidence thus presented ultimately confirmed beyond doubt that DeRoos had been in contact with both items and was therefore present at the crime scene. Police found out that DeRoos and his ex-wife had left Vermont shortly after Rita's murder and separated soon afterward. He then relocated to Thailand, where he converted to Buddhism and became a monk. When interviewed by law enforcement yet again, his ex-wife, who had changed her name and moved to Oregon, subsequently confessed that she lied about him being with her at the time of Curran's murder. Though she was likely unaware of the fact that her husband had just snatched an innocent's life, it was presumed that she, given her recently developed marital bond and affection for him, as well as knowing about his history with crime, had opted to cover for him. Additionally, it was determined that on the evening of July 19th, DeRoos had a disagreement with his wife and headed out for a stroll to cool off. The next day, he instructed his recently married wife to explain to the police officers that were probing Curran's death that he had never left her home. He cautioned her of the fact that his prior criminal record would unjustly make him a potential suspect. Burlington detectives also interviewed a woman who was married to DeRoos in 1974, and she mentioned his penchant for unexpected acts of aggression. She recalled 2 instances where he acted violently around her, one of which involved him taking out a pocket knife and stabbing an unsuspecting female friend in the abdomen without any provocation whatsoever. While he was arrested, he was ultimately let go after the victim refused to press charges for an unspecified reason. In the second incident, she was having dinner with him when DeRuse suddenly snapped, lunging at her and trying to strangle her. It was this incident that ultimately ended their relationship. Tragically, Rita's parents never got to learn the truth of her fate. At a press conference held on February 21, 2023, Rita Curran's case was finally put to rest. Her siblings expressed their immense gratitude to all the detectives who worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. Rita's brother, Tom Curran, had this to say: "I don't think so much about the guy who did this as I do about Rita and my parents and what they went through. I pray to my parents and I pray to Rita." Case number 3, Michael Sharpe. On June 3, 1984, an unsuspecting 25-year-old woman awoke in her Bloomfield residence to the frightening vision of a stranger standing beside her bed. The intruder had gained entry through her home's sliding glass door. He violently clamped his hand over her mouth, menacingly warning he would shoot both her and her roommate if she dared to make a sound. He then proceeded to do unspeakable things to the helpless woman. Before leaving, the man cut off the home's phone line, rummaging through the entire house for any valuables, and even helped himself to a beer. Then, 23 days later, on June 26, 1984, a 30-year-old woman was jolted out of her sleep by the sensation of being blindfolded and bound. Her attacker barged in through the sliding door, pounced on her, and proceeded to rummage through all of her belongings. He forced her down the stairs to lead him to where her purse was located, and then proceeded to viciously assault her. The man then cut off the telecommunication lines and finished ransacking the woman's home. Before leaving, he asked her whether or not she had any good food in the fridge. Then, only 5 days later, on July 21st, 1984, a 24-year-old woman from Windsor was discovered all too late that an intruder had gained access to her apartment through the sliding door and pointed his gun at her head. She was then blindfolded and subjected to a horrible assault. The intruder then forced her into a chair, keeping her blindfolded as he searched for items of value and cash. He again disabled her phone lines in order to obstruct any attempts at communication, altered the time on her clocks, and ran water from every faucet so that his escape would be concealed by noise. Finally, on July 24, 1984, a 24-year-old woman was lying in bed with her 2-year-old daughter at Rocky Hill when she heard an audible click from the sliding door. To her horror and shock, she saw a masked man pointing his gun directly at her face. As if she knew what was about to happen, she pleaded with him to let her move the daughter into another room. He obliged. After putting her kid to sleep, the woman was escorted back to her bedroom, where she was met with the same fate as all the other victims. For years, investigators intently searched and questioned hundreds of potential suspects, from salespeople to employees, visitors near the crime scenes, and people that regularly traveled along Interstate 91 and Route 9 close to the victims' dwellings, but came up empty-handed. Decades came and went, and the case grew cold. The police assumed a single criminal was behind the 4 crimes due to the suspect's similar speech and demeanor, as well as the proximity of each crime scene near I-91 and Route 9. In April 2003, forensic analysis confirmed this suspicion when it revealed that all 4 assaults were connected to one DNA sample. For years, no DNA matches could be found. However, in 2020, all of the victims were contacted with news that shocked them to their very core. The elusive predator, who had forever changed their lives but whom they'd never seen, now had a name and a face they both feared and dreaded. Police had resorted to using an entity that wasn't affiliated with law enforcement in order to finally solve this mystery and tie the DNA profile to an individual. This individual's name was Michael Sharpe. Sharpe, a resident of Marlborough, previously served as the CEO of an organization overseeing Jamoke Academy, a tuition-free charter school in Hartford. After being pinpointed as a suspect by utilizing publicly available genealogy data, Sharpe was tracked down and his DNA was first obtained from trash left outside his home, then from one of his cheeks. These samples matched genetic material gathered in connection to all 4 crime scenes. On November 2020, 69-year-old Michael Marion Sharpe of Marlborough, Connecticut, was taken into custody. In November 2022, Sharpe was convicted and declared guilty of 4 counts of first-degree kidnapping, as well as 4 accounts of first-degree kidnapping committed in the course of a felony. Unfortunately, because the statute of limitations had expired by 1989, he could not be prosecuted for sexual assault. During his trial, all 4 of his victims, who elected to remain anonymous, testified against him. 3 of the women attended in person, while the 4th took part via video conference. Forensic specialists were also present, and they informed the jury that the probability of the DNA sample belonging to anyone else aside from Sharpe was 1 in 7 billion. Sharpe, who struggled to display any form of emotion during his sentencing, maintained his innocence throughout the trial and claimed to have forgotten parts of his life, particularly the 1980s when these kidnappings took place. He asserted that he had no recollection of committing these monstrous acts. "I just don't know how I could have possibly done something so monstrous." Family members of Sharpe also spoke up in court, imploring the judge for leniency. On January 2023, in a Hartford courtroom, 71-year-old Michael Sharpe was sentenced to 72 years. Judge Frank M. Diodabo, who handed down the sentence, imposed a minimum of 40 years behind bars. "You fit that definition of a person who ruthlessly exploit others," the judge told him. The judge compared the pain Sharpe's victims endured to lifelong sentences and described Sharpe as a vicious predator. "We are thankful that these 4 victims finally have some sense of closure. Today's sentencing sends a message to all the victims and families out there that the division's cold case unit will never stop looking for justice for them as well," said Supervisory Assistant State's Attorney John F. Fahey, head of the cold case unit, who prosecuted the case. Case number 4. Opal Weil. In 1987, Opal Weil, aged 82 at the time, was a resident of Pinellas County, Florida. Opal was a well-loved figure among her neighbors, who twice daily could observe her strolling around the area on her routine morning walks. She would also be frequently visited by an entourage of family members and friends who dropped by every now and then to make sure she was doing okay. On the morning of February 9th, 1987, her sister-in-law tried to call her, as she usually did, but Opal did not pick up. Believing Opal had gone out for a routine walk, the sister-in-law kept calling every few minutes, but to no avail. Alarmed, Opal's sister-in-law went to her home and attempted to rouse her with knocks on the door. No answer. Growing more worried by the minute, she went around the back of Opal's house, where she noticed that the kitchen light was still lit, a habit not typical for Opal, who always turned it off once she got up. The sister-in-law then discovered a window pane had been taken off of the door leading up to Opal's room. It was propped up against an outer wall. When the sister-in-law entered, she made a heartbreaking discovery. Weil was lying motionless in her bedroom, with blood around her lips and bruising all over her face. As investigators probed the scene, they uncovered that a ground wire in the phone line had been severed. No fingerprints were found on the door window pane, yet there were signs of cloth or leather gloves having been used. A belt was found on the floor near her foot. A knife was also found with the tip broken and missing on the bedroom floor. It was quickly determined that the home had been ransacked. Several drawers had been searched through hastily, and Opal's jewelry box was left ajar. Her family reported the disappearance of 3 precious items, notably 2 wedding rings and a watch. After forensic experts located hairs belonging to the presumed perpetrator of the crime, they were able to obtain a partial DNA profile. Unfortunately, this was insufficient for them to definitively identify the culprit, as at the time, the DNA did not match any entries in law enforcement's records. In December 2020, more than 30 years after Opal's untimely death, cold case detectives requested that the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and Parabon Nanolabs conduct another round of testing. With Parabon's help, policemen narrowed down the list of potential suspects to 3 brothers. One of the brothers was deceased. The other was swiftly ruled out. All that remained was Mississippi resident Michael Lapnewski. Lapnewski lived less than half a mile from Opal at the time of the crime in 1987. Aiming to establish a forensic connection, detectives initiated an undercover mission, gathering red coffee straws and a spoon that had been left behind by Lapnewski. Both tested positive for DNA, which corresponded to the profile found on the hairs in Will's house. Officers were able to acquire said spoon thanks to the assistance of a Bay Street Lewis detective who owned a local restaurant and knew Michael personally. As part of the scheme, he organized a local advertising campaign offering complimentary meals. A flyer was put on Lapnewski's car in hopes of attracting his attention. The plan worked. Lapnewski was drawn to the restaurant, and officers were able to acquire the utensils used by him for testing. The DNA from the straws and spoon was an exact match to the tufts of hair discovered on Opal's nightgown and bed sheets. On January 26, 2023, justice was finally served. 56-year-old Michael Lapnewski Jr. was taken into custody in Mississippi and extradited to Pinellas County, where he is being charged with first-degree murder. During his conversation with investigators, Lapnewski denied ever being close to Opal's residence during the time period in which she died. Additionally, he maintained he had never laid eyes on her, engaged in any kind of dialogue with her, nor had he ever stepped foot inside her house. Detectives believe he could be linked to other cold cases in the area. In an interview, Opal's great-niece had this to say: "After 36 years, he's been able to walk this earth. He's been able to breathe air, something my aunt didn't get the luxury of doing, and I hope that he's man enough to stand up and confess to what he's done." Case number 5. Mary Frances Hromcik Prieur. Mary Prieur and her husband lived in Flint, Michigan for many years. She was a member of St. Mary Queen of Angels Catholic Church, Daughters of Elizabeth, and was a leader in Girl Scouts. She ran a candy store together with her husband before ultimately deciding to put it up for sale and retire. They then relocated to Lennon, Michigan. Unfortunately, her husband passed away in 1990. Despite the loss of her husband, Mary refused to give in to despair and planted herself firmly in the comforting confines of their town. As a devout Catholic, she would regularly attend all sorts of religious events, festivals, and gatherings. Lennon's local residents also recall seeing her make the trek from her home to the local diner on an almost daily basis. On February 27, 1997, at approximately 12 p.m., Pryor's brother-in-law came to visit her when he noticed that her door was left wide open and her pet dog, who usually accompanied her on walks, was still inside. With no sign of Mary in sight, the brother-in-law decided to contact authorities and report her missing. Michigan State Police K-9 teams were dispatched and began their search. It wouldn't take long for tragedy to unfold, however. A mere 2 hours after she went missing, a trooper and his K-9 partner came upon Mary's body. It was concealed by a blanket. Prior's body was found at the intersection of Lennon Road and M13. Community members rallied after Prior's murder, putting together a $20,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction of the responsible person or persons. In pursuit of evidence, investigators collected DNA samples which they believe to have belonged to Mary's assailant from the crime scene. After conducting hundreds of interviews and following up on dozens of leads, detectives eventually zeroed in on a suspect, a 17-year-old 11th grader by the name of Michael Burr. He lived just a few doors away from Mary's home. Burr was brought in for questioning. However, there wasn't enough evidence at the time to warrant any charges, as DNA technology at the time had not yet advanced enough to successfully determine if it matched what was discovered at the scene of the crime. As a result, investigators were forced to let him go, but not before taking a DNA sample of his to be stored just in case anything changes. As the years went by, Pryor's case grew cold. In 2002, Captain Chris Swanson of the Genesee County Sheriff's Office was assigned Pryor's case. In a united effort, the Genesee County Police Department and Michigan State Police Crime Lab partnered up to bring closure to the case. Subsequently, in November of 2021, a breakthrough was achieved. Scientists were able to match the DNA found at the scene to that of Michael Burr. Burr was arrested in December of that same year. Investigators were now 100% certain Michael Burr was their guy. As a matter of fact, prosecutors would state that there was only a 1 in 1.9 octillion chance Michael Burr wasn't the man who killed Mary Prieur. That's 26 zeros for that guy, Swanson said. Michael Burr was incarcerated in the Genesee County Jail. On 24th November 2021, the Genesee County District Court conducted a probable cause hearing where prosecutors presented their case against him. Burr was charged with 1 count of kidnapping, 1 count of first-degree criminal sexual conduct, and 1 count of second-degree murder. On December 5, 2022, Burr pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and first-degree criminal sexual conduct. His kidnapping charge was dropped. Chris Swanson, who was now Genesee County Sheriff, had this to say: "I had this case assigned to me 21 years ago, and it took me across the country, following up leads and interviews and dead ends, and you just got to stay with it." The case was wrapped up on February 3, 2023, when the judge sentenced 34-year-old Michael Burr to 10 to 20 years in prison for both his second-degree murder and first-degree criminal sexual conduct charge, with the sentences running concurrently. In addition, the court mandated that he must remain on electronic monitoring for life and be registered as a sex offender. Case number 6. Martha Marie Morrison. Martha Marie Morrison was raised in the foster care system of Lane County, Oregon, a county just outside Eugene. Reba, her sister, recounts that their mother was hearing impaired and that Martha had an aptitude for sign language. Martha's past was marred with drug abuse, and she would often run away from her home. Sometimes it would take days before she showed up again. In September 1974, 17-year-old Martha vanished without a trace. Before her disappearance, Martha was last seen leaving her rented apartment, which she and a man she was dating had paid for. Allegedly, an argument between the couple ensued shortly before going missing. On October 12, 1974, the bodies of 2 women were discovered in Dole Valley close to Vancouver. While one was quickly identified as Carol Platt Valenzuela, the other woman's remains could not be identified. After careful inspection, it was determined that the victims had been dead for at least 2 weeks. Authorities were almost certain they were murdered. After the 2 women's remains were found, their bones were examined in a desperate attempt to uncover their identities. Through Carol Platt Valenzuela's dental records, authorities were able to swiftly identify the 18-year-old as one of the victims. Unfortunately, they could not ascertain the identity of the second victim because her dental records were unknown. On August 4, 1974, Valenzuela's husband had reported her missing after she had gone hitchhiking to Vancouver 2 days prior and did not return home. It was the investigators' wish that by identifying her, they could enhance their chances of discovering who the second body belonged to. After Valenzuela was identified, the police sought to interrogate her husband. However, he was in a critical health state at the time due to having overdosed on aspirin. The husband was eventually placed under arrest and, after successfully passing a polygraph test on October 25th, he was released from custody. Despite thorough investigations, the identity of the second victim, estimated to be between 20 and 25 years old, could not be ascertained. After an anthropologist from the University of Washington reviewed the remains, forensic facial reconstructions were created of the victim and distributed to a newspaper. Unfortunately, despite nationwide exposure, no one was able to recognize her. The victim also bore physical characteristics such as curly hair and dental hygiene issues, which were mentioned in the listing. Interestingly enough, she appeared to have previously borne a child. However, whether Morrison ever had any offspring remains unknown. After the initial investigation, police returned to the site of discovery in hopes of gathering further evidence. They even employed a metal detector borrowed from a Snohomish County resident. In the end, police had very little to work with. No DNA profile could be developed at the time, and serial killers such as Gary Ridgway and Ted Bundy were thought of as potential suspects, yet solid proof eluded authorities. After 38 years of dead ends, hope for Martha's case was finally rekindled in 2012 when forensic scientists were, at last, able to create a DNA profile from the unidentified Jane Doe's remains. DNA samples were taken from Martha's sister and half-brother to create a genetic profile that could be compared to potential matches. Upon completion of the profile, the results were compared to those of the unidentified remains. While some form of resemblance was observed, a conclusive match could not be established. Morrison and the unnamed victim were both added to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, which specializes in the finding and identification of missing individuals. Over the next 3 years, 10 missing persons were eliminated as potential identities of the remains until an identification was finally made in July 2015. Apparently, the reason it took this long is that, while in storage, the Jane Doe skull and some of her bones were mistakenly labeled as belonging to Carol Valenzuela. In 2011, discrepancies between Valenzuela's dental records and the skull's teeth revealed this issue. In a final effort to solve Martha's case, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children decided to fund an exhumation and DNA test on her father. The results were conclusive. The remains found did, with a less than a 0.000002% margin for error, belong to Martha Morrison. The puzzle was solved. Now, the only question on everyone's mind was, who was the person responsible for Martha and Carol's death? Investigators already had a suspect in mind: serial killer Warren Leslie Forrest. Forrest is currently detained for the homicide of Christy K. Blake in July 1974. He was apprehended on October 2, 1974, just 10 days prior to the discovery of Martha Morrison and Carol Platt Valenzuela's remains. In 2019, law enforcement officials performed DNA testing on a blood sample discovered on an air pistol owned by Forrest. The pistol previously belonged to a woman, one of the 6 victims that he brutalized in the years before his capture. The DNA test results confirmed that it was Martha's blood on Forrest's gun. The results also showed that he had not only likely murdered Morrison, but also Valenzuela, as the 2 women were found next to each other. Forrest is also considered a potential suspect in 2 other cases: the 1971 and 1974 disappearance of Jamie Grissom and Diane Gilchrist, respectively. On February 1, 2023, Forrest's trial concluded with a guilty verdict on all of the charges brought against him. Prosecutor Lauren Boyd of Clark County reported that the DNA evidence, along with Forrest's history of abducting, abusing, and discarding young women in rural Clark County during the 1970s, was compelling enough to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he planned and executed Morrison's murder. On February 17, 2023, 73-year-old Warren Forrest was sentenced to life imprisonment. Warren's attorney referred to Morrison and Forrest as perfect strangers. He argued that the state failed to meet its burden of proof because there was no evidence presented indicating when or where Morrison perished, let alone how it happened. In a world plagued by tragedy and despair, it can often feel impossible to get justice for those who have suffered. But sometimes, hidden beneath the surface of darkness, lies an unexpected glimmer of hope. Hope that justice, in one way or another, always finds its way.